You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too. Now added bonus for free. The coming release of the new Blade Runner film, I thought would be appropriate to go back and do an analysis of the original Blade Runner from 1982, which does constitute a pretty popular chapter in my book, Esoteric Hollywood. If you don't have a copy, I would encourage you to go ahead and get one from my website, Jay's Analysis. Esoteric Hollywood made it to the #1 spot in Amazon's film and Hollywood industry category. It also has about 90 to 95% 5-star ratings across Amazon, Goodreads, US, UK markets. So go ahead and avail yourself of the full 363 pages and 404 footnotes, which of course also led to my TV show with Jay Weidner, Hollywood Decoded, on the Gaia network. So check those out for a lot more of the information in a similar vein of what you're going to hear in this video. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner presents us with a prescient dystopian future based on Philip K. Dick's novella Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And we'll see in the film that this is not only an accurate prediction of the future's general landscape, but it also tends to be suffused with occult imagery and deep esoteric and symbolic themes. It also raises crucial moral and social questions. The film, I think, operates on several levels, you could argue. The immediate story itself, there's also predictive future analyses with various social critiques. There's the level of covert operations and mind control. MK Ultra, I think, is present in this film very clearly. And you also have a kind of deeper Jungian mythology and archetype level with the alchemical symbology that we're going to see from the character of Gaff, as well as the background imagery behind characters like Roy Batty. So all of these levels, I think, have to be integrated to grasp the full import of the film insofar as Ridley Scott conveys it. It's also interesting that Philip K. Dick himself had some very esoteric, bizarre, fringe views about the end times and so forth, and he kind of felt that we were stuck in some kind of cul-de-sac of history, and that history had stopped at the point of like Acts 11 or 12, the book of Acts. So we were in some kind of weird time loop, side story that was accidental and not intended to happen. And so, unfortunately, I think Mr. Dick, for all of his great writings and for hanging out with the Silicon Valley crew in his days and getting a lot of insights as to what was coming in the future, probably did a little too many drugs and got a little confused. But regardless, the works as a whole are all packed with a lot of predictive programming. And again, this I think has to do with his close connections to many of those in Silicon Valley in that time. The film, of course, begins by showing us the eye, presumably of Deckard, and the eye is wreathed in flame. This is going to be very prominent as a theme throughout the film, the eye, and that's for many reasons. On one level, it's signifying the genetic DNA identification that tells the difference between the synthetic replicants and the actual human beings. But it also signifies the occult and Masonic themes that are prevalent throughout the film, and the idea of, as we're going to see, the gnostic elements of retelling the story of creation and the fall and the sort of Promethean rebellion against the creator, embodied in the character of Roy Batty, who's this kind of Luciferian savior. We see the 2020 landscape of Los Angeles. We see the eye viewing this landscape, and The eye represents the viewer in many ways, and as we discussed in my analysis of Eyes Wide Shut and the reviewing of that film, we are going through a kind of initiatory experience on the part of the viewer. The viewer is going to be shown in many ways the elite plan, and most of what we see is actually still, I guess you could say, hidden from the public, even though it's explained throughout so many instances of fiction and predictive programming. The public is still busy with their eyes wide shut. And for the masses, I think there's no ability to make this kind of deeper level connection and to associate these ideas, symbols, and archetypes. And that's why so much of this Hollywood imagery functions as a kind of hoodoo spell put over on people. So this all kind of is downloaded into your subconscious, but you don't ever really realize that what you're witnessing is a fictional presentation of, in many ways, what's going on in the real world. So if the viewer has eyes to see, I think you can argue that they're actually seeing the future itself, and that's why characters like Philip K. Dick are so important. It also shows the ruling ideology of the upper so-called class, or the scientism of the elite, and we're going to be looking at this in more depth as we go through the works one by one of Bertrand Russell, Jonas Salk, Jacques Attali, H.G. Wells, and many of the actual globalists who describe their religion as one of scientism. But here we see the eye overlooking the LA cityscape, the giant multi-cult dystopia that has been created as a result, presumably, of monopolistic capital control. The global government appears to be here. There's no question. And it is run by the Tyrell Corporation. So you see that there's no distinction between fascism, communism, and monopoly capitalism in this future dystopia. They're all blended into the same system because they all lead to the same final destination. It is significant that we are presented with the eye shots above a ziggurat or a pyramid without a capstone. This is obviously Egyptian symbology, which comes up frequently throughout the film. You can't mistake the owl symbology, which is very prevalent, Bohemian Grove imagery within the Tyrell Corporation itself. And this Egyptian and owl symbology quite clearly represents the ruling class, the elite. This all-seeing eye is flashed between images of the pyramid, as I said, and this connection in this sense, in this context, is quite obviously the idea that the elite are gods precisely because of the technology that they possess. So I think what we're looking at here is a kind of magical worldview in the sense of alchemy as technology. And that's really where we're going with the Gnosticism in this film. In many ways, it embodies Arthur C. Clarke's third law, which is that there's really no significant distinction between technology or advanced technology and magic. The God who controls things in this worldview is the, quote, God who has the upper hand in genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. And I want to show you really quick an interesting passage from Bertrand Russell. Back in 1931, Bertrand Russell, member of the Fabian Society, as well as the inner clique of the Royal Society, basically the controlling establishment of the Western power structure, the Atlanticist power structure. Russell wrote back in 1931, that is 2 years or a year or two prior to the publication of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Russell wrote on page 169 of the Scientific Outlook that in the future world government there will be eugenical regimentation such that the complete sterilization of the feeble-minded will be practiced, and that as a result embryos will be directly operated upon while they are a fetus. So basically GMO babies is the government of the future. As a result of this, Bertrand goes on to say, the technocracy of the future will be run by completely megalomaniac technocrats. And he says this explicitly in chapter 14 of the book. After this, we see the viewer approach the pyramid, as we said, and it's engulfed in a sort of golden sunlight, conjuring up the images of Ra in Egypt. The mysteries of Egypt, of course, center around the godlike philosopher king, or pharaoh, and the material manifestation of Atum Ra thus mirrors the spiritual hierarchy of as above, so below. So on earth you have the emperor, essentially, right? The Egyptian pharaoh being the incarnation and the mirror of what's going on in the divine spiritual plane. And this is relevant because in Blade Runner, you have the character of Tyrell sort of embodying that pharaonic figure. But he's an old, decrepit, almost evil Gnostic demiurge creator, right? As opposed to the kind of creator that the biblical presentation gives. So it's again the Gnostic presentation. So the light then is enlightening the viewer, I would say, in this scene, inviting him along for the ride in the flying car to the top of the pyramid. In other words, for those who can see, you are about to see what they see. Next scene is the Voight Kampf test, which is given to Leon, one of the replicants or the advanced AI bots created by the Tyrell Corporation. This test is designed to see if it is possible to tell the replicant's emotional state. Kampf recalls, of course, Hitler's Mein Kampf, which his manifesto was devoted to struggle and the struggle of the will. Tyrell, we learn, has been in the business of developing these assassin droids, right? AI assassins. And yet some of these replicants do not know that they are programmed with false memories and false identities. Interestingly, this is an actual subject of study by DARPA. DARPA actually does work on the attempts to create implanted memories. And of course, this has been going on for a long time in terms of research through the MKUltra program and then what would later become MK Search, as is detailed in John Marks's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. It's within this perspective that the replicants seem to partly resemble the infamous plans of the various nation states, and particularly the U.S., over the last 50, 60 years to create the idea of a super soldier or a mind control assassin. And ultimately, we know that these programs really resulted not so much in the creation of a super soldier, and not even just in terms of studies related to mass mind control, but ultimately they devolve into studies related to transhumanism. And this is actually the last chapter of John Marks's book, which was, again, written in the 70s. And he's telling you, just like Philip K. Dick, that what was coming was the implementation of transhumanism. MKUltra Subproject 119 was a literature review, which included a summary of the existing techniques of the manipulation of the human organism by remote and electronic means. According to a report in Defense Electronics, this consideration was given to us non-lethal weapons technology, and it was used on David Koresh during the Branch Davidian siege of 1993 as a test case. Research on the ability of magnetic fields to facilitate the creation of false memories and altered states of consciousness was funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency through the project cryptonym Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty was a Defense Department study of remote microwave mind-influencing techniques. That's also mentioned in Dr. Colin Ross's books on MKUltra, Bluebird, and Artichoke. So we have many examples of characters like this, and in the Blade Runner instantiation, it's the character of Roy Batty who kind of embodies this Nexus 6 model, right? The leader of the rebels, the replicants, who is himself a super soldier assassin. He's more human than a human, Tyrell states. And we're not talking about the Rob Zombie song here, although I guess in a way Rob Zombie is talking about, oh, you man, that you man. The retinal imagery in the scene of the Voight Kampf test is in this case once again referring to Leon Kowalski and the identification of synthetic and the real. Leon is given the test and assassinates his tester at a certain point when the trigger words Tortoise and mother are mentioned. signifying in a way a sort of mind control manipulation through symbols and Jungian archetypes, which I think again is crucial in this film. The tortoise is associated with Hermes and Mercury, as we'll see here in a moment. But the replicants, as we see, are given a 4-year lifespan, which allows Tyrell to have total control over them. This keeps them from rebelling, and so there's a kind of implementation of death, and thus Tyrell is pictured as a God the Father figure. In the real world, our so-called elite have always sought to control lifespans of the populations through depopulation, through regimentation of diet and food, as again Bertrand Russell and others, characters like Charles Galton Darwin discuss in The Next Million Years. This is part of full spectrum dominance, which I've done many talks on. It could also have a possible reference to something like a self-destruct programming in the minds of those who have undergone MK. If the notion of programming someone in terms of their mind to, at a certain point, engage in a suicide program, you need look no further than John C. Lilly, one of the MK Ultra doctors himself, who in the book Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer mentions the possibility of wiping children's minds from birth and giving them a completely programmed reality through the use of LSD. So here you have one of the top MK Ultra doctors, the guy who basically was involved in Flipper. Yes, Flipper is in many ways based on John C. Lilly, right? The idea of giving LSD to dolphins, so forth and so on, animals, and seeing the effects of this very degenerate ideology, this radical scientism, is just as guilty as someone like Alfred Kinsey. Lilly brags about and mentions wiping children's brains through LSD. So this is very possible. This is not really the realm of crazed conspiracy theory. Interestingly, Lilly also pioneered the idea of the deep induced drug state inside the isolation tank. Yes, floating inside the tank directly arises from the MK Ultra program. And ultimately, this is supposed to give you the impression that you are in a deep meditative state and seeing deep within yourself and other realms and all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, this kind of stuff, I think, is quite deceptive. You've been watching my analysis of Blade Runner, very in-depth, very esoteric, and based in a lot of dystopian realities that are unfortunately now coming to fruition, including the sex bots and including, as we'll see, a lot more bad news. However, it's not all bad news. There's a bright light at the end of this tunnel, and it is not the bright light of Lucifer. If you'd like to see the rest of this analysis in video presentation, you can go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe at the PayPal links for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. You can also get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, and you can also watch my television show on the Gaia Network with Jay Widener called Hollywood Decoded. Now, this Blade Runner series is also going to be an episode of Hollywood Decoded, which will be different information, some of the same information, but different information from what I'm presenting here. So a lot of different angles that we're going to take on Blade Runner, but definitely check that out at jaysanalysis.com.